Hello, this video is designed to help you get a better sense of the historical events surrounding the Protestant Reformation in Europe in the 16th and 17th centuries. In looking at these events, we can learn about the manner in which religious beliefs, practices, and institutions interacted with and overlapped with the political beliefs and institutions, and influenced by both wealth and power, these led to violence and dramatic change. Hopefully also you'll get to see how these developments played a role in defining the modern world. Most of all, though, it is hoped that you will recognize the manner in which beliefs and ideas spread and then the reactions they provoke in the process. I'd like to start with the story of Savonarola because it does a great job of illustrating the three main forces of the Reformation. I'm not clever enough to make this connection on my own. I stole it from Stephen Kreis, whose History Guide lectures have been on the web since the late 90s. Savonarola was an evangelical preacher. He was a monk who took the city of Florence, Italy by storm in the late 1400s. The power of his words met the spiritual needs of many of the people in Florence, so he became some sort of rock star preacher. People flocked to him. They sank to their knees. They cried out during his sermons. He was so popular that it's no surprise that when Lorenzo the Great, who ruled Florence, would call him to his deathbed in a last-minute attempt to get around his past and find a way into heaven. So as he was dying, he asked Savonarola for his blessing and last rites. But Savonarola would not give him his last rites until Lorenzo himself promised to repent all of his sins, to give up all of his wealth, and to make Florence a democratic republic and give up his power. Now, of course, Lorenzo said no to that last one, so the monk left him to die without God's blessing. But since Lorenzo was dead, Savonarola somehow gets control of the city of Florence until 1498. And he calls on the people to burn all of their books, their paintings, their sculptures, their luxuries, everything that drove men away from a higher spirituality. He wanted people to return to the simple, unadorned ways of God. They used to live that way, but now their lives were overwhelmed by their possessions and the idea of possessiveness. So people were urged to make these giant bonfires of the vanities in the Piazza del Signoria. These were huge fires in which all of their worldly possessions were sacrificed. Now, Savonarola was born and bred in the Renaissance, but he still rejected modern art. He rejected new science. He rejected anything that was not oriented towards the divine presence. And people thought, at least at the time, who would know more about what God wanted than the Father Savonarola? After all, he was in constant communication with God and the angels. But by 1497, Dominicans, Franciscans, and the church authorities at Rome had had enough of Savonarola's evangelicalism, and they were set to do something about it. Things had gotten out of hand. Savonarola was actually winning converts, and they must not have liked the competition. So by early 1498, Savonarola held his last bonfire of the vanities, but this time, however, riots broke out all across the piazza. Father Savonarola was brought to trial for heresy, because he was said to have falsely claimed that he had seen visions of God, and for that heresy he was sentenced to death. Now, what can we learn of this? Well, for one thing, we can learn that people were put to death for what they believed during this time period. That seems like a foreign concept to us, but not to them. We're going to see a lot of violence associated with this religious revolution. People would walk for miles to see a heretic burned at the stake, and then they'd go home smelling of burnt human flesh. Why didn't they just hang him? Well, that is not how you kill the devil. They believed that fire was a cleansing agent, and fire was needed to cleanse these people's souls. Now, the other thing we can learn from this, and this is where the history thinkers come in, is that the three things that Savonarola asked for are the three forces of the Protestant Reformation. For one, it was an attack against wealth. The division of wealth in Europe at this time was immense. One institution which held a great deal of wealth, besides the kings, princes, and barons, and other royalties, was the church. When Protestants revolted against the Catholic Church, some of them were revolting against the wealth it held. The Catholic Church owned a great deal of land and a great deal of gold, and it collected taxes everywhere. Now, I found these statistics in AP European history textbooks and trust them enough to give them to you and to give you a sense of how much wealth the church had at this time. Leo X, shown here in a famous painting by Raphael, was the second son of Lorenzo the Magnificent. It was this pope who decided to raise money to build St. Peter's Basilica by sponsoring another indulgence sale. We'll hear about those indulgences in another couple of minutes. Secondly, the Protestant Reformation was driven to some extent by a need for spiritual fulfillment. There was a need that was not being met by the Catholic Church. The people of Florence, who needed someone to communicate with them, to lead them through their faith, were not looking to the church for this anymore. They needed the rock star Savonarola. I don't want to joke too much about it, but it was clear that they needed something, a spiritual connection to meet some need in their lives, and they were not getting that from the church. Lastly, there's a political theme to the Protestant Reformation. Savonarola's request for Florence to become a democratic republic fell flat when he asked the ruling Medici Lorenzo the Great. But the political connection can be found in hundreds of states, kingdoms, and little principalities that made up Europe at this time. There was no country called Germany or Italy. There were princes that ruled these places, and they were all subject in some way to the power of the church and the leader of the church, the Pope. The church collected taxes, it made laws, it had its own ecclesiastical courts. The Pope's blessing helped royalty maintain their power over the people, but there was always a struggle as to who could appoint bishops, the popes or the kings. And of course there was always a struggle over money. There are a couple great examples that show the power of church in action. One involves an Austrian king, the Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV, and his struggle against the Pope Gregory VII. They had a disagreement over who had the power to invest bishops. Bishops had a great deal of control over local churches. They collected church taxes, and therefore they had a great control over wealth and influence. The king and the pope argued over whether the bishops would be a friend of the pope or a friend of the king. Henry IV insisted that he could pick bishops, so the pope excommunicated him. Now, getting kicked out of the church didn't seem to be much of a problem for Henry until the local princes in his area started to resist his authority. All of a sudden, the Holy Roman Emperor, Henry IV, had to get the Pope to accept him back into the church and give him his blessing. Now, to do this, Henry IV made this famous journey through the Swiss Alps to the northern Italian city of Canossa. He gave up the robes and armor that marked him as a king, and he took on the simple tunic of a monk. He hiked through the snow and sat in front of the locked doors of the Pope's castle for 3 days before being allowed inside to kneel before the Pope and beg forgiveness. In this struggle between the church and the state, here, the church wins, hands down. But that shows how things stood 500 years before Luther. Now, shooting forward 200 years to 1303, we see another struggle between a king and a pope. This time the king is French, Philip IV, also called Philip the Fair. But Philip wasn't too fair with the pope. He actually sent an army to arrest the pope. But Boniface VIII died before the army got to Rome to capture him. This time the issue was taxes. Could the French king tax the churches of France? At first, Boniface totally rejected this idea. But then he declared the year 1300 would be a jubilee year, and the devout of Europe were all invited to Rome for a year-long celebration of spiritual renewal. And a few parties in Rome. With more than 2 million visitors spending money in Rome, Boniface's own spirits were lifted along with his accounts, and he modified his tough stance. He told Philip that the French king could tax the churches, but only in times of extreme emergency and with the Pope's explicit permission. Well, Philip couldn't just let this stand. He made things worse by getting into a fight with one French bishop and had the bishop arrested and thrown in jail. This was too much for the Pope Boniface to take. So the Pope excommunicated the French king, kicked him out of church, and made the most bold declaration of church power we have. He said that all creatures are subject to the Roman pontiff. God has placed us over kings and kingdoms. That didn't seem to bother Philip that much, who then charged the Pope with sodomy, sorcery, and heresy, so Boniface VIII responded with a document called the Unum Sanctum, in which he declared the Church's power and disposed the entire clergy of France. Philip didn't blink. He got his court together in a grand ceremony, and he burned the Pope's declaration in public. Then he sent an army off to arrest this 86-year-old Pope. But the army wasn't fast enough, and the Pope died before they got there. So in this example of a struggle between the church and the state, we can say that the state won? Well, what happened after this may help us figure that out. See, after the Pope dies, the next Pope is elected by a college of cardinals. But those cardinals came from all across Europe. French cardinals somehow got Clement V elected Pope, who decided not to stay in Rome, but rather in a castle in the French town of Avignon. Many leaders in the church thought this was just becoming that the Pope was just becoming a tool of the French king. So they elected another Pope. That means there were two popes. At one point, there were three men who claimed that they held the title of Pope, each excommunicating the other from the church. Are you confused? Well, how do you think the average Christian in Europe felt about this? Now, we don't know. The average Catholic may not have even known this was going on. There was no CNN, there was no Twitter, no Fox, no news to chronicle every step of this drama. These are examples of political struggles between the church and the royalty of Europe. In terms of the spiritual disconnect that existed, many people became more and more suspicious of the religious convictions of the leadership of the church. Bribery was used to gain the favor of local bishops, and sometimes those bishops got their jobs by purchasing them from the church. Since the bishop had control over local finances and collected taxes, he could get in on the take and profit himself, personally. Some of these guys took loans out from banks, bought their position as bishop from Rome, and then paid back the bank with the donations they collected from their churches on Sundays. Everything they collected after paying back the loan was pure profit. Religion had nothing to do with it. When the poor, suffering people of Europe, who placed all of their hopes in the afterlife in the hands of the church, saw these corpulent bishops swaddled in expensive furs, drinking, eating, and carousing at all hours with all sorts of nefarious sinners, the devout began to question their religion. Just like the people of Florence, their spiritual needs were not being met. We have to make an important point here, though. We have to remember that not all of the bishops were this way, not all of the clergy had girlfriends. Many were just as devout as their parishes. They devoted their lives to their faith, but some simply did not. So now we can turn to some examples of the people who tried to fill this void, people who tried to return the church to its roots, to meet the spiritual needs of the devout. Most people are surprised to learn that the average Catholic in these times had no idea what the priest said during Mass. They never even read the Bible. They couldn't if they tried because it was written in a foreign language. The Bible was written in Latin. Not English, not German, not French or Italian. Now, John Wycliffe is the first person to translate the Gospels, the Christian Bible, into English. He was an Oxford professor who insisted that the church was not the ultimate authority in Christianity. The Bible was. He said that people should be able to read the Bible in their own language, which was Middle English, and they could learn about their faith directly from the Bible itself. He even claimed that the clergy should not have any wealth at all. The only reason that John Wycliffe was able to survive was that the English kings at the time did not have a problem with what he preached. He was able to live out his life in relative safety in England, even though the Archbishop of Canterbury condemned him. But nothing would have to happen to him as long as he had the English king's favor. By the time King Henry IV came along, though, 40 years after Wycliffe died, all of his teachings were condemned. The new English king condemned Wycliffe, and his followers were persecuted as heretics, and Wycliffe's body was dug out of his grave. It was burned and the ashes scattered. Now, Jan Hus, another guy who translated the Bible into a local language, was not so lucky. He lived in a region of what is now the Czech Republic called Bohemia. Right in the early 1400s, at the same time the church is struggling with three popes, Jan Hus translates the Bible into Bohemian, argues against the corruption in the church, and gains a large following in Prague. Jan Hus was safe as long as the king protected him, who, by the way, at this time was King Wenceslas, who some of you may recognize from A Christmas Carol. But in any event, Jan Hus was safe until he started to complain about indulgences. It seems that the royalty in Bohemia got a cut from the sales of indulgences, and when the king found out that Jan Hus was hurting their sales, he changed his mind about Jan Hus. Jan Hus was called to defend his views at a special conference of church leaders. It was called the Council of Constance in the year 1415. Now, even though he was given a promise of protection, he was condemned and burned at the stake as a heretic. To this day, July 6th is a public holiday in the Czech Republic, but it serves for the Czechs as an unofficial start of summer. And it may be safe to assume that the average Czech just celebrates the holiday without knowing much of its history, just like Americans at barbecues and beaches on Memorial Day starting their unofficial start of summer and not really knowing where Memorial Day comes from. By the way, whenever you hear someone referred to as a Bohemian, meaning they're a little different, a little radical, a little outside of the norm, that reference goes right back to Jan Hus. But as far as I know, there is no connection between Hus and the 70s Queen anthem Bohemian Rhapsody. I could be wrong, though. So anyway, we've talked about political struggles between the church and state and religious disputes that show the unfulfilled spiritual need among the people in Europe. Now we're going to turn to the economics of the situation. And that's a good thing, too, because it will lead us right to the doors of an Augustinian monk whose name is synonymous with the Protestant Reformation, Martin Luther. Like any other person who stood at the turning point in history and is seen as responsible for immense change, there is much we can say about Martin Luther. But we're going to stick with what is essential. It's important to know that this man was obsessed with his own salvation. There are some historians who can make much of the folk tales of ghosts and specters and hobgoblins and demons in Germany and Central Europe. On the other side of the scientific revolution, and comfortable in all of our modern technology, many of us can scoff at this stuff. And in fact, we entertain ourselves with horror films because we know it's not true. But at the time, most people didn't feel that way. Without scientific discoveries, without books, film, and the internet, there was little opportunity to know anything else. So if you believe in the devil, not as an idea, but as a reality, with Satan as an evil spirit intent on taking you off the godly path into an eternity in hell, you're going to care a great deal about your religion. It's your only ticket to paradise. Now for Luther, this was a constant concern. Although his father wanted him to be a lawyer, he devoted his life to God. And there's this common story of him walking home dark one night on the feast of St. Anne and almost being killed by lightning in a thunderstorm. It is then that he committed his life to his own salvation. He became an Augustinian monk, he followed the precepts of that order, and he did everything the church told him to do in order to ensure his own salvation. Now some people say he was paranoid about his afterlife, but he couldn't find in the church the faith that he was looking for. The church insisted on a devout life, but some of its leaders lived like drunken frat boys, and they got away with it. The church insisted that it stood between the faithful and heaven, and that good works were the price of admission to paradise. As Luther thought and prayed about it more and more, he finally came to the understanding that salvation could be gained through faith alone. That people should read the Bible themselves, that there shouldn't be a giant divide between the laity, the common people, and the church and clergy. The spark that ignited the Protestant Reformation, though, was the sale of indulgences. The concept behind an indulgence is based on the idea that good works get you into heaven. If good works get you into heaven, conceivably, you could do more good works than is necessary for you yourself to get into heaven. You might even have some left over. Now, I'm being way too general and flippant with this, but the idea is that no one does more good works than the church. So when the church was selling indulgences, they were selling the excess salvation that they earned through their many good works, like a modern corporation selling pollution credits it doesn't use. Now, to raise money to rebuild St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, Pope Leo X, that son of Lorenzo the Great, calls for a great indulgence sale. Now, an indulgence is a coupon of sorts. It's an official church document, signed, certified, and sealed in wax by the Pope himself. It offers forgiveness for sin. So if you're concerned that your own good works are not enough to get you into heaven, or if you have an especially bad month and you've sinned a lot, you can go buy an indulgence and your sins would be forgiven. Now, these things act retroactively as well. So if your uncle passed away, and he was the type of guy who always drank too much and stole money from his friends, you could buy him an indulgence to ensure his salvation. The church claimed that his sins could be forgiven by your purchase of an indulgence. One of the most notable salesmen of these indulgences was a guy named Friar Tetzel, who is credited with saying, "As soon as the coin in the coffer rings, the soul from purgatory springs." He was the best salesman because he knew how to enter a town. He had a parade of people with flags and torches and a long train of minstrels, jugglers, animals. It looked like a circus train. And at the back of this parade would be a giant wagon with this chest of indulgences, resting on a bed of red velvet. The thing about indulgences is that when they are sold in Europe, the king would usually get a cut of the profit. Henry VIII of England, for example, would get a small percentage of the funds raised by the sale of indulgences in England, and this was the same for France as well. But for the princes of smaller kingdoms in German Central Europe, each had to broker their own deal with Rome. And Frederick of Saxony was not going to have any of it. He couldn't get a cut from the sales in his kingdom of Saxony, so he banned the sale of indulgences. Tetzel was forbidden from even stepping inside the kingdom of Saxony. But it turned out that he didn't have to. Just like people who cross state borders today to buy lottery tickets in other states or gamble in other states, The people in Saxony left their home to buy indulgences in neighboring states like Brandenburg. And it wasn't until some of these people got their doubts. They might not have trusted Tetzel, so they brought their church coupons, their indulgences for salvation, to a local college professor, this monk named Martin Luther. Now this prompted Luther to write his 95 Theses, which is seen as the document which started the Protestant Reformation. Now it turns out that Tetzel wasn't the only guy who knew about the power of publicity. Frederick of Saxony was one of the more prolific collectors of religious relics around Europe. He had bones from saints or cloths that wiped the face of Jesus before his crucifixion. He even had pieces of the cross itself. Now, of course, we would probably look at this stuff with the doubt of a 21st century cynic and see that these items were hoaxes, but to the devout of Saxony, they would wait online for weeks to see this collection that Frederick would put on display only once a year. And it was during the Feast of All Saints on November 1st. So, Martin Luther, the story goes, nailed his 95 Theses to the baptistry church door on Halloween afternoon in 1517, daring anyone to debate him on the merits and effectively challenging the ruler of the universe, which for Europe in the 1500s was the Pope. This summary of Luther's challenge shows how it appealed to different classes. By calling for an individual relationship with God through the Bible, and removing the barriers between the clergy and the laity, he appealed to the middle and lower classes by giving them a path to their own connection with faith. In that way, it met the spiritual needs of many. By breaking with the authority of Rome, he appealed to the princes of Central Europe, as they found this as a way to seize more authority in their own kingdoms, and incidentally to keep a lot of gold from going to Rome. Now, the lower class took this a little bit too far, and there was revolts that break out across German Central Europe in the 1520s. The lower classes thought they could break with the authority of princes, just like the princes broke from Rome. But the armies of the princes had to teach them differently. Now, Luther himself sided with the princes in this battle, and he wrote a book in which he called the lower classes thievish and murderous. Now, some historians see this switch. They see this as the Protestant Reformation switching the subservience to the church to subservience for the state. But this revolution can't be understated. Luther's declaration caused an upheaval across all of Christendom. Tetzel replied to Luther's 95 Theses with 106 of his own, but Luther and his students and growing army of followers burned Tetzel's books in the streets. Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, was called upon the Pope to take care of that mad monk. But he had his own troubles trying to defend his vast kingdom from the armies of the Turks when they put Vienna under siege in 1529. But Luther was finally called before a council called the Diet of Worms. Now, Diet in this sense means Congress or Council, and Worms is a town in Germany. Diet of Worms has nothing to do with the new weight loss program. Anyway, Luther is credited with standing before the authority of the church and declaring, "Here I stand, I can do no more." The only way that Luther can survive, though, was to live under the protection of the princes of Germany, who all band together as Protestants to declare their independence from Rome. The Protestant Reformation provoked a complete fracturing of the church, with many different denominations, groups, beliefs, and sects, each searching for their own salvation and claiming, in different ways, that they were the only true faith. At the same time, the persistent intertwining of religion, politics, and wealth would continue to propel events forward. By looking at different examples, we can see how this happens. One example is the Anabaptists. In terms of faith, they're different from Lutherans in several ways, but when you look at the list, you can see why most people thought that their practices were too radical. Any group that separates itself from society, that lives on its own in a commune, is seen usually as suspicious. Anabaptists shared all their belongings in what people say was a communist system, and they practiced polygamy too. Now, there are many examples of this. You can look up David Koresh and the Branch Davidians in Waco, Texas in 1993, or the People's Temple of Jim Jones in Guyana in 1978, or even Mormons moving to Utah in the 19th century. The Anabaptists themselves were centered in the city of Munster in what is now Germany. They were surrounded by an army of both Catholics and Lutherans, who stormed the city and put those leaders to death. Remember, though, that the combination of power politics and religions means that these executions can't be simple affairs. The leaders of the movement were tortured, their bodies torn apart by hot pincers, and they were hoisted in cages outside a church as an example to all. Now, the bodies, or rather what was left of these bodies, Stayed in the cages for about 50 years, but the cages still hang today outside St. Lambert's Church. If you trace the family tree of faiths, you might find some connections between Anabaptists in Munster and Mennonite communities currently in the United States today. Now, sometimes religious thinkers, if they're lucky and if they're not seen as too radical, can enjoy a different fate. Ulrich Zwingli lived in what would later become Switzerland, Zurich. His first clash with the church came when he argued that we didn't have to be fasting. His first clash with the church came when he argued that there did not have to be fasting during the season of Lent. He is arguing that in his interpretation of the Bible, he could not find this Catholic practice. And as a rule for him, if it wasn't in the Bible, he didn't believe it. In fact, he taught himself Greek so he could read the Gospels in their original language. But if you take this further, it means that there's no celibacy requirement for the clergy. They could get married. That there's no fasting or pilgrimage. There's no saints. There's no ceremonies. He rewrote the whole Mass. Now, the picture you're looking at is a picture of the Marburg Colloquy, which was a meeting called together by Philip of Hesse, who was one of those princes in Central Europe. He got Luther and Zwingli themselves together to argue about their faith in the hope that they could come to some sort of agreement, and therefore they could help the process of uniting kingdoms across Europe to confront the Pope and his supporters. Now, this effort fails, but it does show the continued interaction of religion and politics. Now, years later, Zwingli is later captured as part of the Catholic Reformation, and he's burned to death on a pile of excrement. Now, in another city in Switzerland, another religious leader, John Calvin, was much more successful. In considering Calvinism, we see those religious disputes that centered on the practice of the faith. In this picture, you can see the Calvinists storming a church and ripping it to pieces. They saw the music, the costumes, the pageantry of the Roman Catholic Church as a distraction. They saw the worship of saints, the statues, paintings, relics as blasphemy because they weren't ordained in the Bible. Calvinism is a very severe faith, requiring a devout adherence to a strict moral code. When John Calvin himself was in charge of Geneva, he ruled it like a theocratic dictatorship. Playing cards, dice, gambling were outlawed, church attendance was made mandatory, taverns were closed. Now, Calvin's services were plain and simple. He placed great importance on the sermon. His sermons were very logical, very learned. The most prominent feature of Calvinism, or the feature that history teachers like to focus on, though, is the concept of predestination. It's the idea that there was a list of people going to heaven that was made at the same time the universe was created. Now, many students can't see how this would make someone more devout. Why should I care? If I'm on the list, I made it. If not, there's no hope. That is, again, easy to see on this side of the scientific revolution in the 21st century. It wasn't so easy then. There is a connection between the hard work of these people, and there's no question about it. These people were workaholics. The Puritans who left Amsterdam and England to live in the colony of Massachusetts, they were Calvinists. They left everyone that they knew and most of what they had to start a new life in a complete wilderness, thousands of miles away from every comfort they knew. Now, the violence between different denominations, kings and princes and rulers continued for the next 50 years. It wasn't until 1555 that the princes, emperors, and kings found a way out of this mess, and that they could call a ceasefire and make it possible for every prince to determine the faith of his kingdom. The only stipulation was, however, that they couldn't be Anabaptist and they couldn't be Calvinist. The Peace of Augsburg meant that if you were a Catholic, though, living in a Protestant state, you were faced with the choice of converting or leaving your home. You could not take your wealth with you either. That's a tough choice for anyone to make. The violence in Central Europe may have been reduced a little with the Peace of Augsburg, but the Calvinists who left Switzerland and spread their faith in France encountered a different fate. Now, these Calvinists in France are known as Huguenots. Now, the problem in France, at least from the perspective of trying to keep the peace, is that the population, especially among the wealthy and some royalty, was evenly split between Catholic and Protestants. The King of France at this time, Charles X, ruled at the behest of his mother, Catherine Medici. Yes, that's the same Italian family that we talked about before. They sure get around, don't they? But anyway, France had just gone through a series of civil wars itself. Huguenots had secured control of several fortified towns, and they had a sizable following. Now, Catherine Medici, who's an ardent Catholic, thought it best to try to keep the peace with the Huguenots and appointed some to her court. She even arranged for the marriage of her daughter, Margaret, to a Huguenot, a guy named Henry IV. Now, it was just following their wedding, however, that this good feeling fell apart. Catherine and Charles X were subjected to relentless criticism by the Catholic members of the court. These Catholic members saw the creeping Huguenots into power as a threat, and they were convinced that something had to be done about it. Now, because the royal wedding, which was held in the Cathedral of Notre Dame, Paris was full of Huguenots. The Protestant Prince Henry IV had many of his friends and relatives there. Catherine was convinced that a list of these Huguenot leaders should be drawn up, and at a specific time, they'd all be assassinated. But like many other well-thought-out plans, things didn't work out the way that they had intended. Once the murder started, mayhem ensued. People in the streets were incensed with violence, and they saw this as a holy war. And they thought that the only way to save Paris was to kill each and every Protestant they could lay their hands on. Now, the estimates are sketchy, but it's safe to say that more than 3,000 people were killed. Some of them were women and children, some of them old and infirmed, and some of these people were butchered in the streets and in their homes. Now, there are several paintings that show the Queen viewing these corpses in the street, and it is said that the rivers in Paris ran red with blood. The Pope himself, Gregory VIII at the time, actually commissioned a special coin to commemorate this slaughter and celebrate it. What is interesting, though, is what happened later. Henry IV would eventually become the King of France, but to take the throne he had to convert to Catholicism. It is claimed that he said, "Paris is worth the Mass." When he was king, though, he issued an Edict of Nantes, which allowed Huguenots to live in peace and practice their faith in France. He even let them keep their weapons in fortified cities. But when Louis XIV took the throne of France, and he was a Catholic, he said he went to Mass 3 times a day, he revoked this edict, saying, "One land, one king, and one faith." Now this leads us lastly to England, in which the Protestant Reformation again advanced as an interplay of religion and politics. Many people know the story of Henry VIII being unable to have a son and making himself head of the Church of England because the Pope would not grant him a divorce. Fewer people know that he had already asked the Pope for permission to marry Catherine of Aragon in the first place. Catherine of Aragon was the widow of Henry VIII's older brother, Arthur. No, he was not King Arthur. This Arthur died before assuming the throne, but his younger brother, Henry VIII, married his surviving wife, which allowed the relationship between England and Spain to remain secure. Now, Catherine's mom and dad were the same Ferdinand and Isabella that funded Columbus's expedition to the New World. Now, one of the reasons the Pope wouldn't grant this divorce can be seen in this family tree. Charles V, remember that Holy Roman Emperor who was told by the Pope to take care of Luther? He was her nephew. So the Pope's greatest political supporter, Charles V, who controlled all of Spain and its colonies in addition to much of Italy, Austria, and the Holy Roman Empire, was related to the woman that Henry was trying to divorce. And that just wasn't going to happen. Even though Henry VIII totally rejected Luther and earned the Pope's congratulations as a defender of faith years before, Henry VIII had a political problem, and he had much to gain by bringing Luther's Reformation to England. So he forced Parliament to pass the Act of Supremacy, which made him head of the Church of England. Effectively, this creates the Anglican Church. It meant that he could seize every possession and all of the land of the Catholic Church, and distributing this wealth and land among his supporters made him a much stronger king. It also allowed him to embark on his marriage, his divorce, and his execution spree, which took him through 6 wives. It's important to see that the religious changes brought by the Protestant Reformation to England were minimal. The new Anglican Church looked much like the old Catholic Church. Even though it was Protestants that thought that this didn't go far enough, some of these people were Puritans, and they eventually went to America. Now, when Henry VIII died, his daughter Mary tried to bring Catholicism back to England. Some called her Bloody Mary because she didn't hesitate to burn heretics. She was only queen for 5 years, but she condemned more than 250 Protestants to death. And incidentally, she married her first cousin, once removed, Philip II, the King of Spain. This was the same Philip II who drove all those missionaries into the Americas and revived the Spanish Inquisition. After Mary's reign, Elizabeth I ruled England for 45 years. Now, Queen Elizabeth brought the Protestant faith back to England. She revived the Anglican Church, and she also worked to reduce religious violence by saying, "I have no desire to make windows into men's souls," meaning she didn't want to find out the religion of people. It doesn't mean it was necessarily safe to remain a Catholic in England, but it was sort of a don't ask, don't tell situation. Catholics had to remain in hiding. They could not practice their faith in public. and they would be worrying about the future of England led by someone who they thought was a heretic. But we'll end with a story about what it would have been the most devastating act of religious terrorism ever, if it had not been stopped. Now, when Elizabeth died without children, the crown passed to a distant cousin, the King of Scotland, James IV. And as he becomes king, James I of England, many Catholics saw this as their chance to gain freedom. They hoped that this new king would share their faith. When they found out that they were wrong, that the new king would persecute them just the same, a group under the leadership of a guy named, oddly enough, Guy, that is, Guy Fawkes, conspired to bomb the House of Parliament. This is a group of Catholic terrorists. They secured a lease to a basement under the building of the House of Parliament. They started to smuggle in barrels of gunpowder, and in the end they had 36 barrels of gunpowder, the equivalent of 1 metric ton, directly buried underneath the House of Parliament. The plan was to blow up Parliament during its opening ceremony, when the king and his entire court were present. If they would have succeeded, they would have thrown England into a complete turmoil. The only equivalent you could understand would be imagine killing the president and every person in the House of Representatives at once. It turns out, though, that a conspirator warned a member of Parliament about the plot, trying to save his friend by telling him to stay home that day. This exposed the plot, and everyone was arrested on the 5th of November. By January, they were condemned to death. They were tortured, and each was executed by having their limbs tied to a horse. Actually, it was a team of 4 horses, one on each arm and one on each leg, to pull their bodies to pieces. Now, it's hard to find the line between religion and politics in this execution. The Attorney General of England said that the conspirators were being pulled apart by horses, and they would be suspended in the air as this happened. As the ropes tightened, they would be suspended in the air. They would be put to death halfway between heaven and earth, as if they were unworthy of both. And perhaps that serves as a metaphor for this time, when religion and politics were halfway between both.